Welcome to the Curiosity Crisis. We challenge ourselves to explore the world of business, tech, investing, and science. Get curious and be part of our journey as we discuss, challenge, and learn.
So today we're diving into a really interesting topic. We're basically looking at how big tech companies, for example, Microsoft, Google, and Amazon, are looking at powering their own operations with their own generation sources, whether that's solar, wind batteries, or nuclear. We're also going to talk about the energy landscape when it comes to big tech. So there's a lot about AI. And energy demands from that, cloud computing, global connectivity, and just how much energy that requires. So we're going to give a little bit of context about that, how the picture is changing and what's not changing, and what trends that we think are here to stay. So I'm really keen to dive in. But before we do, Luke, what is keeping you curious?
Yeah, so the stuff that's been keeping me curious is actually going to pop up in today's episode. So I have been spending a lot more time on AI stuff. There's been some interest professionally on my end, so I've been doing a bit of reading, and some of the stuff will pop up today. So I've done a lot of research on stuff. But what about you?
Completely random, very different. But I'm pretty interested at the moment, curious about what I can actually learn from reading fiction. So we've talked a little bit about that before, and I know you and I talk about it, but the interesting thing is, I'm reading just for enjoyment in fiction, but I end up learning a lot about the context of the world and random different things. For example, I'm reading a book right now, and I'm learning a little bit about life in Afghanistan and what it was like in most of the war-torn years of the 90s. Mm-hmm. So it's just something that I'd never really think about. I hadn't really thought about before, but it's a really interesting novel, and I'm learning about that through fiction. So pretty interested in what I'll find the more I read.
Yeah, that's awesome. Oh, nice.
Epic. All right, well, let's dive in because there's a lot to cover. Why are big tech companies investing in their own energy generation systems? What is driving this trend, Luke?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of four main areas, and I'll touch on them a bit individually. Obviously, there's massive energy needs, which is why this is relevant at all. There's grid challenges, which I'll speak about in a second. Then there's sustainability goals, which they've committed to. And then there's cost control, okay? So I'll actually just tackle grid challenges first. Mm-hmm. Something to keep in mind is that all of these operate within America. And the American grid is very different to a lot of other grids, in that they have this weird this kind of system where sometimes the transmission of energy actually costs more than the generation of it.
Oh, wow.
And I think it's just kind of by nature of it being sometimes state grids, sometimes that grid is very fragmented. And so, because of that, then you have reliance issues and resilience issues. And so, especially if you have a huge data center, you essentially already need your own power source because it's just not, it's such a risk to have to deal with that. So that's kind of a massive one, irrelevant of where things are headed. So then there's obviously the huge energy needs. So tech giants, they already need a lot of energy because of all their data centers, their cloud services. And for instance, Google's annual energy use it's over 16 terawatt hours, which is insane. So that's enough to power over 1 million homes. And I think something to consider is kind of the trajectory of all of this, which is AI, which is that they want to be able to offer these products and they want to be able to have them in their cloud and they need to be able to train. And so all of this requires energy, right? And essentially they want to do this quickly. So they want to have energy sources. And the long-term goal for a lot of them, which we'll look into pretty soon, is nuclear. And I'll come back to this in a second. So then they have their sustainability goals, which is, what they've committed to. They've said, Microsoft, for example, aiming for carbon negative by 2030.
Yep.
We'll see. And then there's the cost control. So like I just said with transmission, they can calculate how much energy they need, they know how much it can cost, and they have huge amounts of capital. So realistically, they're actually really good contenders for doing some of this stuff.
Yeah, because they will self-consume it.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. And if anything, it's just vertical integration, making that stack cheaper. So it also is a bit of a competitive advantage against each other. And it also means if one of them does it, the other two have to kind of do it.
Yeah.
So it's this weird standoff as well.
I think the grid challenges and cost control, even sustainability, like maybe the energy grids that they operate in don't offer that sort of stuff. Like they're not green enough, they're not cheap enough, they're not reliable enough. So literally they're just doing it themselves. And, we talked about it in energy, like the trilemma of affordability, reliability, and sustainability. So they're just like, oh, sick, we're big enough, we're going to do it ourselves.
Yeah.
But one thing I did want to pick your brain about, and I know you look into AI a lot, is how is that changing the picture? So obviously, AI at one point looked very, very data hungry. There has been some news that has come out that it could be much less intensive, and I know you look into that. So yeah, can you give us a bit of a spiel on that?
Yeah, so I guess the main thing that's kind of happened recently is that some people are aware that there's a company called DeepSeek, a Chinese company, and they released a model that was incredibly efficient and didn't take much money to train, which meant that it didn't take much data, it didn't take that much compute relative to other models at least. And it was a type of model called an MOE, which is a mixture of experts model. That's just an architectural thing, but essentially it means it's quite efficient. And then the way they trained it, they did some stuff with distillation, which means is they use a different model to get to train theirs. They do all this clever stuff. But essentially, it didn't cost as much in terms of compute, and that also means by inference with energy, right? But what was interesting was that they published a paper with all of this information in it. And if you read into it, because the notion that you'd come away with is, okay, so we don't require the same energy and compute to achieve the intelligence that we want. But what was interesting is in their paper, what it actually said was that so much of the compute ended up being post-training, not pre-training. And what that means is we've basically gotten to the point where the whole internet gets fed into these models. Yeah. And that's all in pre-training. But what's interesting is post-training, you can extend. You can keep it going for essentially as long as you want, essentially as much, as many iterations as you want, or depending on the data you have. Yeah. And so a lot of people think that the economics is flipped, where this stuff isn't required. But if anything, it's actually required more. Okay. There's this this paradox about when the cost of things goes down, the demand actually goes up. Yeah. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. But the main thing is that this has actually become more relevant than it was, even though I think the market especially doesn't feel like that's the case.
Yeah, okay. So, yeah. What do you mean the market doesn't feel like that's the case?
Well, when this model dropped, for example, I think it took a few days for the market to kind of figure out what was going on, but like Nvidia's stock dropped by over $500 billion. Okay. And there was this huge reaction about, this stuff is this is the bubble's going to burst, and maybe it still will. I don't know. But it's more the point that the demand is still here. These things are still requirements. So
these things meaning the AI
energy,
tools,
compute, the stuff that the commodities of producing these services. These services will still be used. The architecture might change a little bit. The way that you do it might change a little bit. But you still need energy. You still need compute. You still need time. All that.
So we believe, I guess, that the trend is that we still are going to need a growing amount of energy to serve big tech and AI and cloud computing and all that sort of stuff. It's not dropping off a cliff and becoming a fraction of what it once was.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, really interesting. Well, I mean, that probably sums up, I guess, the context that we need. So let's get into, some of the things that we're really interested in is in that these companies are actually taking it under their own wing to produce their own energy. So they're not like a typical company, I guess, that would buy from an energy provider or buy from the energy market. For example, let's start with Microsoft. What's their approach and why is it addressing their energy needs?
Yeah, so Microsoft actually is an investor, I believe, in a lot of, or a couple of nuclear energy startups. So they're really interested in SMRs, which we've talked about previously in our nuclear series.
Yeah, so small modular reactors.
Yeah, small modular reactors. And they're becoming more and more, useful. There's a lot of startups that are working on them. They've come up with some really novel solutions, and they're really not that far away from being super, super useful, especially for a thing like a data center. And so Microsoft has this huge kind of investment into some of these, and it really does benefit them a lot if this kind of works out. So actually, I'm fairly sure we mentioned them in the nuclear episode, or if we didn't, it definitely came up in the research, which was Helion Energy. And they're aiming to deploy these SMRs by 2028. And yeah, that would help Microsoft so much with with AI and cloud services. And it means that they can have their distributed cloud compute, right? Like it doesn't mean that they have to have this one huge data center that has everything, because SMRs allow you to have smaller ones around the world. So it would just help them a lot. And, additionally, they've talked about how they want to be directed towards having zero emissions or eventually negative. So yeah, that's kind of where they're at.
And nuclear obviously is like at least net zero in itself. Like it doesn't produce any carbon emissions. So that helps, grow their services, provide reliable energy, and hit their sustainability goals if they can do it, on time with their plans and within their cost. So I guess what's the key takeaway from Microsoft?
Yeah, so Microsoft has said that they want to be carbon negative by 2030. They're really looking to get these SMRs deployed and using them. I think just quietly, a couple of the big tech companies have been scrapping some of their environmental goals.
Really?
And I think it's one of those things that they might end up bringing back, but they're just doing it because in the meantime, some of this nuclear stuff will take too long to happen. And so what they've done is they've said, what, that's fine. We'll get a gas plant up and running.
Okay.
We'll work on our AI models or our, whatever, our all this compute, all this energy that's required. And then they can probably put these carbon goals back in place later. But it's either Microsoft or Google. One of them just quietly kind of scrapped them. But I think it's because they see it as a race between them. And they're like, what, this might hinder us. So let's get rid of it. Not defending them. They can do what they want.
Okay.
But yeah, just something to keep in mind. But it is still, it really reflects the way that their company looks. So yeah, I think it's a good goal for them to have. I hope they don't scrap it if they haven't. But yeah, that's basically what they're trying to do. And they're trying to do it quickly as well. So if we take a look at Google, do you want to run us through how Google's trying to address their energy needs and what's kind of different to Microsoft's approach?
Yeah, so I think one of their big goals was to be, a leader or be 100% powered by renewable energy. So one of the things that they've tried to achieve, and it's probably a big thing within renewable energy, whether you're claiming your energy is renewable because, at the end of the day, like you are just consuming an electron off the grid and you don't know what produced it. So whether it was coal or gas or hydro or solar. But what they've done is they're focused on achieving 24/7 carbon-free energy, but not from nuclear. They've relied heavily on wind and solar, and then also using energy storage systems. And then they, with their in-house tech, have produced systems that optimize their energy efficiency in data centers, so reducing some of their energy usage, which is that other side. Like you either produce more or you use less. So they're trying to be a bit more efficient there. And to highlight that, even as far back as 5 years ago, they'd signed deals totaling 1.6 gigawatts of wind and solar across their multiple operating locations, like across continents, to power their consumption. And they're trying to match the use of renewable energy like one-to-one with the production that they've built or they're taking off. So they're trying to show every electron or every hour of energy that they use is from a carbon-free source. So it's a really interesting time, like carbon matching and energy production matching strategy that I think is really aligned with its sustainability goals, but also saying that, hey, we can do this with renewable energy. And I think the interesting thing is, obviously, that's, I guess, a lot of people's goals. However, if they actually can prove that they're doing it even up to like 60, 70, 80%, then it's kind of shown that it is possible to cover your energy usage with wind and solar. And I think they're trying to prove that, including what their smarts are, with algorithms and AI and how to optimize for them. So it's a pretty different way of doing it, but it's a really interesting way to show that they're serious about being net zero or as close to it as possible. And then it'll also show the shortfall, or that really hard last 5-10%, which we talk about a lot in energy and stuff like that, which is you might have to spend an extra 50% just to cover that last 10-15%. So yeah,
definitely. It's so interesting how it's a completely different approach though, isn't it? Like, high energy density nuclear in SMRs, or, whether you get a bigger reactor, whatever that is, versus like forget that. We won't worry about just powering our own stuff. We'll look at like basically tracking it on the books, and we want to like we'll reach our goal completely another way by adding to the kind of net system and then accounting for what we're using and what's being produced, which is a really interesting way of doing it.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because, like, I guess, that other one, which is Microsoft strategy, which is like, nuclear is really predictable and what it's going to produce. So we're going to use that and match it to our load. Google's, for example, saying we've got so much load, we can match the renewable production to what we're using and prove that we're using a lot of renewable energy to do this. So it's just a flip, and it's like an interesting way to think about it because they're so big. They've got their own teams that can plan this out.
Just a quick intermission. Thanks so much for listening. If we could just ask a quick favor, if you could send this to a friend and recommend it, we would greatly appreciate it. It's easy to do and it helps the show out. Thanks. And before we get into the last one, I'd like to just say as well that like this can be extremely beneficial just for the industry, right? Like, it's private money coming from Microsoft into essentially research and startups of SMRs, which is huge. And then on Google's side, it's not just a proof of concept. It's like, it's one of the big dogs proving that this works, and that, I just think it's really beneficial for the industry. Like, even if it doesn't work, it proves it doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And it teaches that, to you. And the other thing is, like, in terms of environmental, they are massive energy consumers, probably bigger than like some small countries. And you mentioned 16 terawatt hours. If that doesn't mean much, like I think you mentioned it's more than 1 million homes. It's like millions of homes, tens of millions of homes is 16 terawatt hours for, say, a year. So it's a massive
like a
energy
whole country.
use.
Like
Yeah. To wrap it up with the big tech and just to highlight the different approaches, do you want to give us a little bit of a sneak peek into Amazon's approach?
Yeah, so Amazon, we haven't talked about the biggest one yet, right? AWS has the largest market share. They are the biggest cloud provider in the world. And we haven't talked about them yet. So, Amazon is focusing on distributed energy networks. So basically, they've built over 20 gigawatts of renewable capacity globally, and they've supplemented that with on-site solar and at like their fulfillment centers. And their strategy is basically to explore like microgrids. They have these huge warehouses that have such a large kind of pull on the network that, we've talked about microgrids previously. I think it was in our energy series, that they can support local grids because of the amount of energy that they require as a business in each of these areas, because they already have their distribution centers, right? Yeah, so they're kind of doing something completely different, which is, because like the economics and the supply and demand of microgrids work quite differently, right? Because we've talked about it previously where, smaller solutions then can fix things. So for example, battery packs that are attached to your like rooftop solar suddenly become much more useful in a microgrid than compared to a really big grid where the draw is much bigger. So yeah, Amazon's approach is kind of focused more like narrowed in on each of their like individual centers.
Yeah, and I think, obviously, you talked about the build out of renewables by themselves, like, rather than relying on energy companies or governments or whatever to build it out. So that's helped them get to their goal of renewable energy. But also this energy model and the microgrid model that you talked about has really helped them secure independence and a lack of reliance on these external grids. And I think it reflects a different model where obviously Amazon and AWS is a tech company, but then also the logistics company, the logistics side of things where they're really distributed, and they also need crazy amounts of reliability and uptime because obviously, their promise is same day delivery and like just the absolute utmost customer service. So I think they've really focused on the reliance, where it seems like Google is really focused on the sustainability, and then Microsoft is a little bit like on the scalability and making sure they've got that power for every bit of their operations. So it's a really interesting way to look at it, where they're all taking it into their own hands, but have slightly different approaches.
Yeah, definitely. And I think something that we didn't mention was that their goal is to be 100% renewable energy by 2025. So this year, end of this year. Now, to be fair, that might only be on their Amazon kind of supply business in terms of delivery and warehouses. And so it might not be everything. But yeah, that's why they've set up all these solar farms and this rooftop installations. So yeah, their approach is definitely very different again.
So what do you reckon, like, where does this go from here? I guess you can speak to it from like a tech and trend side on energy demand, or we can go into like the learnings for companies. But what's your key takeaway, and where do you see this trend going?
I mean, my key takeaway is it's the privatization of energy, right?
Yeah.
It's that, and whoever you blame or whatever you say the reason is that's come about, whether you say it's, grids not being resilient enough and useful enough, or whether you say it's the cost of energy supply dropping and then these companies having huge capacity to be able to do that, it doesn't really matter. I think at the end of the day, it's that energy is being privatized, and that's through all these different avenues, right? So that's whether, you operate solar, or whether you're investing in SMRs, or whether you're looking to, we talk about just like renewable contracts like Google's going to be doing, and doing some accounting on that side. I think the point is that you have 3 world leaders that are looking at privatizing their energy and owning their own stack. And doing something about it. And I think that trend will continue, and especially for companies that have the capital to be able to do that. Yeah.
I completely agree. And I think that's one of my big ones, where there's a lot of learnings for other companies as well when we talk about, I guess, decarbonization. And actually, the funny thing is that when you're trying to decarbonize, we talked about this in other episodes, you end up using more electricity because you change some of the fossil fuel use to electricity use. So you replace gas with electric or whatever. So that demand is going up as a general global macro trend, whether you talk about specific AI demand growth or not. So that there is going to be more companies and use cases where you need your own energy. There's changing demands from customers. They want clean energy. So taking it into your own hands rather than relying on a centralized grid or the government is seeming like what makes sense for big players. So there's probably a lot of other companies that will look at these big tech, first movers into privatizing their own energy and think about it, because we do know that at least rooftop solar is blown up in use, but how long before people are trying to take care of all of their energy needs completely themselves, just like these guys have? So I think it's a growing space, and we're going to see lots more of it. So it's very interesting to be in it. Well, I think that's all we have time for today. So thanks heaps, Lukey. As always, thanks for listening. Find us at curiositycrisis.com and Curiosity Crisis on Instagram. We're on all major streaming services, so you can listen how you like. Just a favor, if you got anything out of the episode, please give us a 5-star review on your podcast player. It always helps us out and helps grow the podcast. So thank you, and catch you on the next episode.